Okay, I think we're gonna go ahead and get started. Um, this also will be recorded and will be up on our new website as well as on our YouTube channel later. So we'll let people file in, but I'm sure people will be watching later if they're not going to attend in person. But yeah, just to get us started, my name is Chancey Callahan. I am the program coordinator for IRMS and the new program coordinator I started about a month ago. So still getting the hang of things. It's been really great working with Alex so far and getting to know more about the institutes specifically. And of course, that's what we're here to kind of discuss a little bit. But I definitely want to thank Amy Littlefield for being here with us to talk about, anti-abortion strategy specifically and kind of pushing back against that. And so I want to give a short bio for Amy, if I may, and that it was included on this flyer, but I'll say it just in case. The Institute for Research on Male Supremacism is pleased to welcome journalist Amy Littlefield for a deep dive into the history and strategy of the anti-abortion movement in the United States. Amy Littlefield is the abortion access correspondent for The Nation and a freelance journalist who has covered reproductive health and justice for the New York Times, Reveal, the New Republic, and many more outlets. You can read more of her work on Kansas, how Kansas kept abortion legal, and her co-authored article with Heron Greensmith on the links with anti-trans legislation, which I'm sure you will get into a little bit as well today with us. And we also have Alex here, who is the executive director and co-founder of IRMS. So really excited about this conversation. How things will go. We have a few prepared questions, but anyone who is on the webinar can leave questions in the chat if you want to pose questions. We'll also have a designated time after Amy gives her remarks as well. So if you want to leave the question in the chat for me to ask, I can do that. I'm the moderator today. But you can also use the raise hand function during the Q&A section to ask, Alex or Amy anything you would like during that time. But I think I'm gonna, go ahead and turn it over to Amy at this time. We'll have a little bit of time afterwards to talk a bit more about the training institutes, of course. But yeah, go ahead, Amy.
Thank you so much, Chancey, for that introduction. And thank you, Alex, for inviting me to give this talk. This is such a cool series and such an interesting, fascinating subject to be able to engage with you all. I hope we can have a conversation. So feel free to, interrupt, raise your hand, ask questions as we go along. I'm eager to learn a lot from you all as well. And so I have, I thought I would sort of give an overview of a few key moments in the history of the anti-abortion movement. I am a journalist, not an academic, so I'm coming at this with this sort of really maybe obvious sounding questions that keep me up at night these days, which is how did a group that represents a statistically fringe point of view actually, right? The percentage of people who actually want abortion to be totally banned is quite small and has been for a long time. How did that group organize so effectively? And how did they create what I would argue in terms of tangible results has been maybe the most successful social movement since the civil rights movement? If folks disagree with that, please push back. I'd love to hear your examples of other movements that have been more effective. But I think after the fall of Roe v. Wade in particular, and after decades of incremental efforts to restrict abortion access and curtail reproductive health care, and now we're seeing the full fury of those same networks being directed at trans folks, I think there's an enormous amount of power both at the elite level in terms of our institutions and at the grassroots level, in terms of folks who are making phone calls, sending postcards, organizing, conducting civil disobedience. I think this is a really important social movement to study. And so I've spent many years covering abortion rights and covering abortion access and talking to people who are engaged in the struggle to expand abortion access. And that's been sort of like my beat. I cover it for The Nation, like I write about abortion rights. But in the past few years, I've tried to be more intentional about engaging more with anti-abortion folks, because I think we really need to understand this movement. And we need to understand their strategies, and we need to understand how they've co-opted the strategies of the civil rights movement and used that terminology and those strategies to their advantage. So I've been spending a lot of time with a few grassroots activists on the anti-abortion side that I think are particularly interesting. And I'm working on a book project about the anti-abortion movement now. So I'll sort of try to test drive some of the ideas and people that I'm writing about and thinking about. And would love to hear what you all think and what your questions are. So I will launch in, and let me see if I can share my little PowerPoint here. Cool. Can you all see this? Yeah. A lot of my previous work on this topic has sort of focused on what the abortion rights side did wrong. I wrote a piece for the New York Times Sunday Review that was about where I think the pro-choice movement could have done things differently. I talked to more than 50 folks in the reproductive health rights and justice movement for that piece. And there are a few key themes where I think the abortion rights and pro-choice movement did not succeed, and where I think the anti-abortion movement actually did extremely well, and where the sort of strengths and weaknesses lined up in a way that led us to the moment where we are today. One of those was building state and local power, which is something that the anti-abortion movement did super effectively. We're seeing that play out today. These are state legislatures and city councils that are passing anti-abortion laws, that are passing anti-trans legislation, that are trying to curtail the teaching of critical race theory. This whole sort of raft of right-wing and Christian nationalist policies are advancing for the most part, not in Congress, but at the state and local level. Of course, we also increasingly have federal courts that are willing to greenlight those policies. Another huge part of it is the failure to center women of color, to center people of color, to center Black women in particular. And so I want to start with the Hyde Amendment as sort of the moment where that failure really, this was like the first major misstep. In my view, the Hyde Amendment is sort of where the battle for abortion rights, I think, was lost 3 years after Roe v. Wade. It was an incredibly decisive moment that I think wasn't recognized for what it was at the time. So 3 years after abortion became legal nationwide with Roe v. Wade, the Hyde Amendment was passed by Congress. And this was a piece of legislation that banned the use of federal funding for abortion. And it meant that most people who were on Medicaid could no longer get their abortions paid for by Medicaid. So instead, they would have to raise hundreds of dollars out of pocket, or they would have to stay pregnant. And vast numbers of people, according to the research that was done on the impact of the Hyde Amendment, did in fact stay pregnant. Other people sought out unsafe providers. Rosie Jimenez in 1977 became the first known person to die from the Hyde Amendment. She had received a Medicaid abortion before the Hyde Amendment was passed, but after, when she got pregnant again, she could no longer afford it, and so she went to an unsafe provider and died from a subsequent infection. We can talk about it in the sort of trend that I'll bring up repeatedly of like the pro-choice movement failing to center women of color adequately, right? Like there was a hesitance to rally around Rosie Jimenez, who was a single mom, who lived in a border community, who was Latina, who had had at least one abortion in the past, and a sort of thought that maybe one death wasn't enough, right? So the Hyde Amendment is a crucial moment in terms of like the racial and economic politics of abortion. And so I want to just like drill down a little bit on the anti-abortion strategy that went into this. Are folks familiar, like maybe you've heard of the Hyde Amendment? You're like, okay, yeah, that's a thing I know about. Okay. So if you've heard of it, you probably know this guy, Henry Hyde, and his famous quote, "I would certainly like to prevent, if I could, anybody from seeking an abortion. Unfortunately, the only vehicle available is the Medicaid bill," right? So this is sort of held up as like, this was clearly a classist piece of legislation, right? They were like, gee, we'd like to restrict it for everybody, but we can only ban it for poor people. They're the only ones we can control, and so we'll pass this. What's interesting that I found in sort of digging into the history of the Hyde Amendment is that it wasn't actually Henry Hyde's idea. So in 1973, the same year that Roe v. Wade came down, Senator Jesse Helms passed the Helms Amendment. This was similar to the Hyde Amendment. It banned abortion funding in the Foreign Assistance Act, so it had to do with abortion funding overseas. And, surprise, surprise, in the, racial policies in the United States, like no one really noticed this or cared about it or made a big stink about it at the time, right? It didn't affect people domestically. It was about overseas aid. And then in the few years after that, we saw unsuccessful attempts to try to get a version of that passed in the United States that would impact folks on Medicaid. And interestingly, the first version of it actually would have impacted contraception because of the way that it extended to abortifacient drugs and devices. It could potentially have been read to apply to emergency contraception and IUDs. So folks like Bella Abzug in Congress at the time made us think about that. It did not pass. And then another attempt in 1975 was also defeated. So 1976 rolls around, and a group of members of Congress who had been trying to get this ban on federal funding through approached Henry Hyde quite intentionally. And I talked to one of the lawmakers who led this effort, Bob Bauman, and he was very unpopular, and he had tried to get this passed, and it had been like immediately defeated because he just was, like, by his own admission, kind of an annoying guy who liked to like drill down into procedure. And so he was like, look, Henry's charming, he's a good speaker, like we'll choose him. And that's how Henry Hyde became like the face of the anti-abortion movement. He was like sort of intentionally chosen as the front man for this. I just think that's a little bit of like interesting anti-abortion strategy. Another part that I want to highlight is like the behind the scenes advocacy that went on for the Hyde Amendment. In this moment, right after Roe v. Wade, the anti-abortion movement, its power basically comes from the grassroots infrastructure of the Catholic Church. That's like most of the anti-abortion groups were Catholic, and the Catholic Church is an extremely like well-connected organization with lots of local power bases, right? And so I talked with some academics who had written a paper about the Hyde Amendment because of what a fascinating piece of procedure it was. Like, it was different from other congressional measures in that it was like an attempt to ban abortion funding through, hi kiddo, through a appropriations bill, which is like kind of technical and nerdy and like wasn't really done and was kind of frowned upon. And so these academics had spoken with Mark Gallagher, who was a lobbyist for the Catholic bishops for a long time. And he said the organizational structure of the Catholic Church is an absolute dream. And he described this system where they would tax each Catholic in the diocese a penny, and they were able to raise huge amounts of money to support their anti-abortion efforts. And there's an example of one of the early opponents of the Hyde Amendment, Dan Flood, who was a Democrat from Pennsylvania, basically giving this extremely impassioned speech denouncing the Hyde Amendment,
calling it, saying he was anti-abortion himself, one of the many politicians who would say, I'm personally opposed to abortion, but he said a vote for this amendment is not a vote against abortion, it is a vote against poor people. That's what it is, as plain as the nose on your face. And there were other Democrats who picked up this same language. They said, look, regardless of what you might think about abortion, you can't just ban Medicaid funding and leave private funding alone. Like this is this is clearly, transparently unjust. And then Dan Flood, Mark Gallagher told these academics how he got every single Catholic pastor in his congressional district together to write a letter to Dan Flood, telling him like, hey, you can't do this. And he got the letter and he flipped. And so that was the organizing power of the Catholic Church. The National Right to Life Committee, which is the biggest, most influential anti-abortion group, one of the biggest to this day, but certainly back in the 1970s was the largest, was originally started by the National Conference of Catholic Bishops. Their leader at the time that the Hyde Amendment passed was Mildred Jefferson, who some of you all might have heard of. She was a Black woman, she was a Methodist, so she was this great front person for these efforts. She was also a very good speaker who really effectively used these early fetal images and would go on national talk shows and show these images and speak very passionately and effectively. Because the movement was mostly white, mostly Catholic, and she was not, she was elevated very quickly. And also because of her, powerful speaking skills and gravitas. So what I think is also super important to highlight about the Hyde Amendment is the Congress that passed it had Democratic supermajorities in both chambers. This was right after Watergate. So the Watergate scandal brought a bunch of Democrats in. And this would not have succeeded without a tremendous amount of Democratic support. So the partisan lines that we're used to thinking about around abortion just did not exist in the same way back then. In fact, one of the most powerful voices against the Hyde Amendment was a Republican senator from Oregon named Robert Packwood. There were no women in the Senate, not so fun fact. So where was the abortion rights movement at this time? After a few years after the Hyde Amendment first passed, Faye Waddleton became the head of Planned Parenthood. She was the first Black woman to lead Planned Parenthood, and she made restoring Medicaid funding a cornerstone of her leadership. She said, right out the gate, this is one of the top issues that we need to focus on. And she was shouted down, not by abortion opponents, although I'm sure they were shouting too, but by leaders within her own organization of state affiliates who thought this is too radical. We can't go for federal funding of abortion. We're going to lose our federal funding if you do this. And this was a huge and defining moment. If you think about to this day, what are the groups that you think are the most passionate, enthusiastic, radical groups within the abortion rights movement today? A lot of you might say abortion funds. Why do abortion funds exist? Because people don't have money for abortions. Why do they not have money for abortions? Because of the Hyde Amendment, right? So there's this direct line from this policy that took away funding of abortion for people, precisely those people who did not have hundreds of dollars to pay for an abortion, right? That created the landscape, not just of abortion access, but of abortion activism, because groups that had a reproductive justice framework, groups that cared about access and cared about low-income people's needs, were working their hardest to get people to care, to get to pay, to raise money to pay for people's abortions. They became mutual aid organizations. And this is a pattern that I think happened not just in the abortion access world, but in decades to come would happen around issues like maternal mortality, would happen around racial justice and policing, right? Like we can see other areas where this has happened, where like the absence of state support means that activist groups that notice the problem and want to fix it end up becoming mutual aid groups, end up providing the service themselves and trying to fulfill a state function. And I think we can trace that line directly back to the Hyde Amendment. Questions, thoughts, feelings about the Hyde Amendment before I move on?
I had a small thought, if that's okay.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
have a question about, I guess, like, when you say, talking about how this issue is, this hot button type of issue, and it's one that is furthered in this like culture wars rhetoric. So I wonder about like getting past that, because like you were saying, talking about the first Black woman who ran, Planned Parenthood, and it not being, the opponents or the people who are anti-abortion who were attacking her. And it was more so the fact that the issue is one that they saw as kind of like, it's too hot to touch. And so I wonder sometimes about how we kind of bridge that gap in a sense and get to those issues if they're too difficult to even talk about for a lot of us.
That's a great question. I think like, I think there's a really powerful effort now that's intertwined with the Black Lives Matter movement, intertwined with conversations around economic inequality, that's saying like abortion is an economic issue. It's not a quote unquote culture war issue. It's a racial justice and an economic justice issue. And it has to be situated within the frame of reproductive justice, right? With alongside issues like maternal mortality and access to basic health care. And when you think about it in that frame, and I think opponents of the Hyde Amendment, led by members of Congress like Barbara Lee, who's been a champion of a bill to repeal the Hyde Amendment that's been introduced year after year, groups like All Above All that are working to repeal Hyde and related bans on public funding of abortion, they're really situating that conversation within a holistic framework of like reproductive justice, basic medical services for everyone, the right to have children, the right to have social services to support those children. And so I hope that gets at your question of like, how does this go from being like a third rail, which I think the Hyde Amendment was like public federal funding of abortion was a third rail for a long time. It's not something that mainstream pro-choice groups would talk about, right? And a lot of Democrats, including our president, Joe Biden, supported the Hyde Amendment for many years, right? When did that become untenable? A few years ago, when the reproductive justice movement, Black Lives Matter, conversations around intersectionality, I think really made it untenable all of a sudden. And Biden switched really quickly, switched his position on the campaign trail, realized, oh, wait a minute, like this is no longer a mainstream position, right? I better come out in support of abortion access in every zip code, and this not being a matter of your geography or your race or your economic status. And so I think like that's a win for the reproductive justice movement and for groups led by people of color that are trying to change the conversation. I think the fact that it wasn't part of the mainstream conversation for a long time had a lot to do with white leadership, had a lot to do with this sort of defensive position that the movement took for a long time, which was to sort of defend against abortion bans through the courts, to choose to not fight measures like 20-week bans that maybe seem strategically, like, oh, we might lose, this could be risky. And I think there's a change happening in that conversation that's good, that's long overdue. That was a long answer to your question, but I appreciate it.
No, thank you. And I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just like, I have this question I might forget, but please.
No, don't be sorry. I welcome the conversation and the questions. All right, let's stop looking at Henry Hyde's face. So the next sort of like really important moment that I want to highlight is 1980. and Ronald Reagan, the first, quote unquote, first pro-life president. There were presidents before that who recognized the power of abortion, who saw that the Christian right was kind of starting to form and build power. There was a moment when Richard Nixon was president where he was about to sign a bill that would have given us basically like a version of universal childcare. And Pat Buchanan was like, hey, this is like communism, and like, wouldn't it be good if you like vetoed this and we could do this whole like family values, you know, like anti-communism thing. And he did, and he vetoed, he didn't sign it. And so then 1980, Reagan comes in. Reagan, who had signed one of the most liberal abortion laws when he was governor of California, then comes in as president. He's fully embraced the anti-abortion movement. He was recognized the power of the Christian right. And the person I put on this slide is an activist that I've been following named Monica Migliorino Miller. She's been part of the civil disobedience wing of the anti-abortion movement for many years. And she told me about how she had worked for Democratic candidates early on, sort of before she fully entered the anti-abortion movement. But she felt like there's this shift that happened in the late 70s and then in 1980, where Democrats really started to gravitate to the pro-choice side. Republicans really started to gravitate towards the anti-abortion side. And for folks like her, for whom abortion was becoming the most important issue, she felt like there's no way to go, where to go, except aligning themselves with the Republican Party. And so for people like her, for whom religion, she's Catholic, so, you know, people for whom religion and opposition to abortion were crucial issues, started to gravitate towards Republicans, and that became kind of a gateway into conservative politics for those people. And I think this is really important in part because like the Republican Party really recognized the power of grassroots anti-abortion activists, recognized how it could use single issue voters in a way that I don't think Democrats did. And there's been an imbalance, I think, that's played out over time in terms of the extent to which Republicans have embraced the anti-abortion cause and the extent to which Democrats have embraced the pro-choice cause. Reagan comes in, he champions the Human Life Amendment, which is the goal of the anti-abortion movement at that time, was to pass and still is, but it's just been unsuccessful so far, was to pass an amendment defining life as beginning at conception. And Reagan, you know, at least rhetorically supported that. And so this was a huge moment in terms of the solidification of the alliance between the Republican Party and anti-abortion movement. The next like kind of big moment. Oh, did anyone have comments about the 1980s or anything? A lot happened in the 80s, including like, you know, Reagan, obviously what he's most known for, I think, is like his austerity policies, right? And Sarah Matheson in her book, which is very good, called Reproduction Reconceived, about the history of Roe, talks about examples like the Maternity Care Coalition that formed in 1980 to address high rates of infant mortality in Black communities in Philadelphia. And they were like, we're going to overhaul the whole system. We're going to change the way, you know, all of this works. And then they were like, there's so much need here and so much suffering, and we can't work with suffering people without doing something immediate to ameliorate their suffering. And they became sort of mutual aid groups. So they were helping people enroll in WIC. They were, you know, helping people figure out their benefits. They were doing sort of like direct service work at the same time that they were trying to hold these institutions accountable. And so there was this process that I talked with Sarah about for a recent article where like you're sort of obscuring the system while trying to help people get what meager services they can, even though you set out to challenge it. And I think that's a pattern that we can see, again, with abortion funds and with other organizations, especially in this era of the 1980s, where like a lot of feminist groups, you know, groups that might otherwise have been advocating really proactive reproductive justice policies were sort of stymied and put into more of a defensive posture. Hi, Reagan, did you have a question?
Yeah, hi. I was really interested in the idea that pro-life voters and activists were essentially pushed out of the Democratic Party, and it makes me want to flip that question and ask, like, was there a missed opportunity within the Democratic Party to, you know, include those voters? I'm just wondering what the alternative would have been, since the line seems to have been drawn, although as you say, it wasn't clearly down party lines. So I'm just kind of curious on your hot take on that.
Yeah, totally. And I should say, like, this is Monica's framing of it, right? Which is like, she feels like she was pushed out of the party. I can't say, like, you know, maybe she would have found her way to that party anyway, you know, like, because abortion is so wrapped up, not just in the Republican Party, but in like a conservative worldview. And I think over time, she's very much, you know, embraced a lot of aspects of that worldview. You know, I don't know, and I also don't know how many people there are out there who are like grudgingly voting for Republicans solely on the issue of abortion and aren't also somewhat seduced by the racial politics of that party or, you know, other aspects of their agenda. So I should say, like, I haven't studied the, you know, numbers around that. I just had this conversation with this one person who I thought was really interesting, because she's written about seeing abortion as a human rights issue and seeing being anti-abortion as a liberal position. And that was maybe more of a thing back in the 60s and 70s. There were some folks who were mired in the sort of like steeped in the like anti-Vietnam War protest movements, who were anti-nuke, who were involved in civil disobedience around the war, and were also anti-abortion. But over time, they came to feel like such a fringe within those circles that they branched off. So I don't know if I'm answering your question. Like, I think it's, I don't know, like, is there an alternative, right? Like the feminist movement, for example, like reached a place where I think pro-choice was sort of the, like, they weren't going to entertain an idea of being anti-abortion and feminist in a lot of cases, because it seemed to a lot of, at least to like reproductive health and justice activists I've spoken to, like this is sort of like the baseline. If you can't determine whether or not you have the right to continue a pregnancy, then like, how do we even move on to the other, you know, feminist priorities on the list? And I do, like, I'll say in terms of like the Democratic Party, I do think there have been quite a few efforts to make the Democratic Party a big tent and to embrace anti-abortion folks. Like, I think even Nancy Pelosi, like Democratic leaders have not sort of been as vociferous on the abortion issue as Republicans have on the other side, right? I mean, on one end, you have like South Carolina Republicans introducing bills to literally implement the death penalty for abortion. And then you have, like, in a lot of cases, Democratic leaders do make room in the party for. I mean, Tim Kaine, you know, Hillary Clinton's running mate, was personally pro-life. Like there's actually like, so I don't know. I mean, again, like folks who have dedicated their careers and lives to being anti-abortion, like Monica, have a perspective on that I think we should listen to. But I don't know that I totally agree that that's what happened, right? I actually think like Republicans saw an opportunity that Democrats were like didn't see necessarily, which is like the Republicans figured out how to use the abortion issue strategically and to their advantage and really opportunistically in winning over single issue voters, evangelicals, white Catholics who are otherwise, you know, Democratic. And I think Democrats, in part by sort of like hedging their bets, you know, Bill Clinton, like in the 1990s, it was all about safe, legal, and rare. Like that was, you know, the best he could do. And that's like not necessarily a, you know, a winning rallying cry, I think, in the same way. I don't know if I'm answering your question or just sort of like talking around it. I think it's a good one. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah, exactly. Republicans figured out how to weaponize abortion for their purposes faster than Democrats. Yeah, that's what I was trying to say. So the other moment that I wanted to highlight next in 1990, wow, I'm showing you guys the whole thing. Okay. Is the Summer of Mercy. Are folks familiar with Operation Rescue, the rescue movement? Basically, starting in the 80s and into the early 90s, the militant wing of the anti-abortion movement started to pursue this strategy of converging on abortion clinics in massive numbers and engaging in civil disobedience tactics. Operation Rescue was an organization that, interestingly, these tactics, the sort of early folks involved in these tactics were people like Monica Miller and Julianne Wiley, who were women who in some cases had more liberal leaning points of view when it came to issues like the Vietnam War. But Randall Terry, who's this very dynamic male leader, comes in, becomes the head of Operation Rescue. And in 1991, he and his followers converge on Wichita, Kansas, which was the home of Dr. George Tiller, the abortion provider who was shot and injured, had his clinic firebombed, and then, of course, ultimately was assassinated in 2009 by an anti-abortion extremist named Scott Roeder. So years before that happened, in 1991, Randall Terry and his followers descended on Wichita. The clinics in the city agreed at the behest of police to shut down for a week while these protests were going on. That emboldened these activists even more. There were so many people involved in these demonstrations. It was described as basically like an anti-abortion Woodstock. They filled stadiums. They had sort of revival style meetings that lasted for 46 days. 2,600 people were arrested. And the demonstrators involved in this would do things like what you see in this picture here. They would lock themselves underneath cars. They would chain themselves to the doors of clinics. They use these extremely militant strategies, and then they would, when police would arrest them, they would go dead weight. It would take hours to arrest them. And the reason that I highlight this moment, not just because like the optics of this were important and like the use of these like strategies coming out of the civil rights movement, coming out of the anti-Vietnam War movement, and the like sort of unapologetic embrace of like, or co-opting of like civil rights rhetoric, right? Like these are folks who compare themselves to Martin Luther King, like unabashedly, like who saw this as the next frontier of the civil rights movement. Folks like Monica, who had sort of a broader social justice point of view, had sort of winnowed down to a focus on the unborn, on the fetus as their winning cause. Jennifer Holland wrote a really interesting book that has a framework that I think is useful for understanding this moment. It's called Tiny U, a Western history of the anti-abortion movement. And she talks about how the anti-abortion movement sort of became a civil rights movement for white people because it was centered on the protection of the fetus, which is like this perfect vulnerable victim, right? You don't have to disrupt any of the structures of inequality or poverty or racism or climate change, or, you know, and it's really interesting talking to some of the militant single issue anti-abortion folks that I've talked to of how they talk about having a more comprehensive worldview, caring about animal rights, environmental rights, like, and then deciding like this is the most vulnerable cause. This is the most vulnerable type of person I can imagine. And so this is like the cause that I'm going to get arrested for and put my life on the line for. So anyway, so in Kansas, what ends up happening is at the back of these demonstrations, and journalist Judy Thomas writes about this really powerfully, they had tables and they were signing up folks who were involved in these protests to run for Republican county precinct positions, basically like the lowest rungs, the building blocks of the Republican Party. And so the like mailing list that resulted from this moment where they were like radicalizing people, you know, like they're having their first experience getting arrested and doing these acts of civil disobedience, and they're hearing pastors and people like preaching to them, and they're like getting all riled up, and then they're like signing up to run for office. And what ended up happening is that in Sedgwick County, which is the county where Wichita is, anti-abortion people, so abortion opponents, had less than half of the positions in the county's Republican leadership before the Summer of Mercy. And then the year after the Summer of Mercy, that surged to 83%. So they went from being a minority position to a majority position opposed to abortion. And just from like the fervor surrounding these protests. So it was like a radicalizing experience, and one that pushed people to get involved in local politics. And that ends up transforming the Republican Party at these like very local, granular levels. And that pattern over time, basically what happened is it like dragged the Republican Party in states like Kansas all the way to the right, not just on abortion, but on a whole host of issues. Where were Democrats and supporters of abortion rights in this moment? Again, like Bill Clinton used this framework of safe, legal, and rare. So he's defending legal abortion, but stigmatizing it at the same time. He ends up signing the FACE Act, which basically puts an end to the rescue movement because it imposes very steep felony charges and jail time on anyone who gets arrested for blocking the entrance to a clinic. But so in this era, like abortion rights supporters in many cases were like literally in a defensive position where like they were organizing clinic defense, they were organizing folks to like rally outside the clinics and go face to face with folks from Operation Rescue. I heard a great story from an activist recently in Michigan who talked about being at a protest where anti-abortion activists had used a van to block the door of a clinic. And this was in Detroit, and they had a bunch of like city workers and auto workers and folks, and they like all got together and they picked up the van and they moved it. So this was the type of like counter civil disobedience that was going on in this moment. Questions, thoughts about the 1990s? Anyone remember the 1990s? I do. Hi, Rachel.
Hi. This is kind of about the 1990s, but also sort of how it relates today. I just came back from a trip to Wichita where I was monitoring an abolitionist conference and sort of hearing a lot of, I guess, the strategy in the 90s seems very similar, especially with what you're talking about with kind of co-opting civil rights language, even just like their name of calling themselves abolitionists is, of course, kind of following that similar pattern. I don't know. I was just wondering if you have expertise in abolitionists and if you have like a sense of where that faction of the movement is going, because it seems so similar here, but they also seem very much uninterested in getting involved in politics. So I guess I wonder if just where you see that, side of the movement going.
I would love to hear more about what you saw in Kansas if you're able to share it.
Oh yeah, sure.
Yeah, the place where I saw the abolitionist movement, and for folks who aren't familiar, if I'm understanding correctly, like these are folks who are critical of the mainstream anti-abortion movement because they feel it doesn't go far enough. And they believe they have co-opted the term abolition to refer to abolishing abortion. So where I saw this coming up is like in Texas in recent years when they've been weighing basically the most extreme anti-abortion policies we've seen. These are folks who showed up in droves to protest against the anti-abortion bills because they were not total bans on abortion. And they didn't go far enough to towards abolishing abortion. So I would love to hear more about what you saw. I hadn't been aware of groups active in Midwestern states like Kansas that had embraced that same framework.
Yeah, a lot of the message was exactly kind of what you were saying about the need to push back to not, because they don't consider themselves to be pro-life. A lot of them said they're pro-justice, which is why they want abortion to be criminalized as equivalent to murder. And so most people believe they want the death penalty for abortion providers who got multiple murders. Some want murder for women. You know, they don't universally. I only spoke to one man who wanted like the death penalty charges for a man who supports his partner in getting an abortion. Yeah, I'm just curious because it seems like such a politically unattainable strategy. I sort of worry about supporters feeling disaffected with that and kind of moving to violence. The group that I was with very much stressed that they weren't a violent organization, but I don't know. I don't know what's in their future.
Yeah, it's hard to see how that doesn't end in violence, right? Like, because even folks who don't advocate the death penalty for abortion providers or abortion seekers because they realize that's not a politically favorable position for them to advocate. If you believe abortion is murder and that conducting an abortion is tantamount to murdering a toddler or a child, full-grown child, it's hard to see how that doesn't end in the idea of justifiable homicide, right? Which is something that folks in the circles of Operation Rescue have embraced, right? This idea that killing an abortion provider is justifiable because they're murderers, right? It's sort of like moving the, I don't know, it's like they're moving the Overton window so far that you wonder if some of these folks who are perceived to be on the fringes are actually just saying the quiet part out loud in some cases. And it's, if it's a difference, like less of belief and more of tactics, right? And rhetorical strategy, which I think is something the anti-abortion movement is actually very good at, right? Is crafting rhetorical strategies that make their views feel more mainstream than they are. Because again, like the number of people who think that abortion should be abolished and people who are involved with it should have the death penalty is an even smaller fringe of, you know, that what's already a minority of point of view. I don't know. I'm curious what you think about how, like, do you think this is something that's catching on, or?
I don't know. I hadn't heard about abolitionists until I went to that conference. But there's like about 300 people there, so not a huge number, but you know, kind of a big number. And it was a lot of, like, there was children there as well. Like, it was like a family affair, which I guess signals that it's, I don't know, they're moving with like a very normalized rhetoric that could appeal to not just like the most extreme fringes of society, but yeah, just everyday people.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. Where are
Thank
you
you.
going to be writing about it? Where can we read more?
I won't be writing about it, but I shared information with a colleague who works for PRA, so they might be writing about it soon. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Rachel. Cool. So the next moment I was going to highlight is the 2010 midterms. I know I skipped a lot of stuff there in like the 2000s, right? But so President Obama gets elected in 2008. There's a huge billionaire funded political backlash to his election, right? The Koch brothers and Americans for Prosperity bankroll these Tea Party groups that are opposed to the first Black president. And they're sort of bent on these economic policies that impact billionaires, but also like very much intermingled with you know, folks who have a right-wing worldview on a whole host of social issues as well. And what's really consequential, I think, is the outcome of the 2010 midterms at the state legislative level. So where we start to see like this huge surge, and this is a chart that shows anti-abortion restrictions enacted since 1973. And basically after 2010 is where there's this huge spike, and then it kind of stays pretty high. And this obviously ends right before Dobbs, so I don't know what the chart looks like today, but probably like this spike is like similar to what we're seeing now in terms of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ bills, right? Like this sort of numbers and record shattering, you know, every week breaks a new record. Like that's the sort of pattern that I can remember from this era around 2012, 2013 happening with anti-abortion legislation, where you're just like, oh my God, there's so many bills that like we can't even track them all. You know, that's the sort of methodology that comes about because of this huge wave of Tea Party Republican victories that happen at the state legislative level in the 2010 midterms. And again, this is about like going back to that point I mentioned in the beginning, like state power and city and local power. Like this is where the anti-abortion movement and conservatives in general are extremely skilled at building a base of power, and progressives are more focused on federal policy, on fighting back in the courts. And so that's what allowed this like absolute mountain of anti-abortion state legislation. Then obviously skipping ahead to the fall of Roe, another hugely important moment. This guy in the photo is Markley Dixon. I don't know if anyone is familiar with him. He is the so-called traveling salesman of the anti-abortion movement. He drives around in his pickup truck. He started out in Texas, convincing small cities and towns to pass sanctuary city for the unborn ordinances that basically ban abortion within their city limits. He starts out doing this in small towns, no one really notices, and then he brings it to Lubbock, where there's actually a Planned Parenthood The ordinance ends up getting passed there. The Planned Parenthood has to stop offering abortions. And what these ordinances have is this private civil enforcement mechanism where everyday citizens can sue their neighbors for aiding or abetting an abortion. And that's how this is enforced. And that ends up being a test drive for Senate Bill 8, which gets passed, the 6-week ban that passes in Texas. And because of this private civil enforcement mechanism, the courts allow it to go into effect months before Roe v. Wade is actually overturned. And so Mark Lee Dixon is sort of at he's partnered up with this guy named Jonathan Mitchell, who's a conservative legal strategist, whose ideas really center on this legal concept that laws that are struck down by courts never actually die. They're still enforced and they're still enforceable. And this is a legal strategy that Mark and Jonathan are still using. They're using it most recently in an effort to bring back the Comstock Act, which is an 1873 law. Any Anthony Comstock scholars or experts in the House, he's basically an anti-pornography, anti-vice zealot who boasted of getting people jailed for distributing things like information on contraception. He boasted of driving people to suicide who were, threatened with jail time because of his anti-vice laws. And he's being brought back into relevance now because Jonathan Mitchell and Mark Lee Dixon are arguing that the Comstock Act from 1873 is still enforced and can be used to ban the mailing of abortion pills or devices. And I think it's likely we'll end up seeing that argument making its way toward the Supreme Court before too long, because it's in these ordinances that Mark is getting passed successfully in states like New Mexico, where abortion is legal. And so there's a collision between state law and city ordinances that at some point will probably be resolved in the federal courts. Thoughts on Texas, Mark Lee Dixon, SB 8? Questions? Cool. Well, I thought I would sort of try to end on a hopeful note, which is what we started to see after the fall of Roe. In 2022, Kansas became the first state to vote on directly on the issue of abortion, with an abortion referendum that had been brought by abortion opponents who did not know that Roe v. Wade was going to fall right before the vote. There was an absolutely enormous grassroots operation, people canvassing, people phone banking, folks who'd never been involved in politics before, people pitching lawn signs. I went out to Kansas to cover this moment around the vote in late July of 2022. Super exciting. And so Kansas, a ruby red state, defeated this anti-abortion amendment. And then we saw in the most recent midterms, 5 other states where abortion was on the ballot, and the abortion rights position won in every single one of those initiatives. So I think we're starting to see signs of the majority of people who support abortion rights becoming a mobilized majority, and starting to build local power around ballot initiatives. Michigan's another really exciting example where they not only passed a reproductive freedom referendum in the midterm election, they also brought a trifecta of Democratic power in the state. And we saw just recently they repealed the right to work law in Michigan, right? So there's a pathway, I think, where abortion can be sort of a gateway for progressive issues too, where something like a ballot initiative that brings folks out to vote on the issue of abortion then can become a stepping stone towards a host of other progressive priorities. That's my hopeful spin on things and where I see things headed, where I hope things are headed. And yeah, I'm happy to take your questions. Oh, I wanted to end by showing, and let me just bring up this. Have you all seen this ad in Ohio? Has anyone seen this yet? Oops. Okay, hold on. I'm going to show it. So this is an Ohio ad that was put out. So Ohio is the latest state that's trying to pass a ballot initiative in favor of abortion rights. So it's a state with a conservative gerrymandered legislature where defenders of abortion rights think their best shot is taking it directly to people. So they're trying to get a ballot initiative on abortion. And this is part of a very well-funded effort to defeat the amendment. I'm just going to play it.
Your daughter's young, vulnerable,
Can you all hear?
online. You fear the worst, pushed to change her sex or to get an abortion. You have some right to help her through this, but activists want to take all that away. Under their proposed amendment to the Ohio Constitution, the state shall not interfere with individuals getting abortions or sex changes, meaning you could be cut out of the biggest decision of her life.
Now you can all see my workout videos that I do, so that I don't despair. Okay, yeah, I feel like the reason that ad is so striking to me, and I'd be curious to hear other folks like reaction to it, is like they figured out like, oh, oops, abortion rights are really popular. People are going to vote for abortion rights. Well, maybe we should use this anti-trans stuff that's floating around and see if that will get, if that's like the red meat we need to try to get, you know, our voters riled up. And like that pivot is terrifying. And I think, I think we need to like see how this whole rhetoric of like parental rights, right? Which like, this was some of the like low hanging fruit around abortion rights too, was like parental notification and parental consent. Like we've seen that same trajectory with anti-trans that, oh, this is about saving the kids. This is about parental rights and parental permission. And then it's like, oops, we're restricting it for people of all ages, right? And like the mask comes off and we see that this was always about like banning gender affirming care, just like it's been about banning abortion from the jump. So yeah, I'd be curious to see what other folks think of that ad, but I think it's sort of like, yeah, that's where I'll leave it. Okay, that's not a hopeful place, but I think it's important to recognize and connect the threads here. Harry Greensmith at PRA and I co-authored a piece together where we sort of trace the like lineage of anti-abortion legislation, anti-trans legislation, and also the rhetoric. You know, you see folks like Tucker Carlson out there like literally calling gender affirming care providers murderers and criminals. Like that's how abortion providers got killed, right? That's right. And you know, people with AR-15 showing up to Drag Time Story Hour, Drag Queen Story Hour, like stuff like that. So I'm going to stop talking because there's an interesting discussion in the chat that I feel like I want to bring into the discussion.
Yes, thank you so much for giving us that background. That definitely helps us kind of contextualize and see kind of where we came from and where we could be headed if we're not, you know, careful. So thank you for that. Yeah, I wanted to bring in some of the things that were in the chat. Robin said the preemptive nature of the pivot is the scariest part, as you were saying. And then Reagan said the whole save the children, quote unquote, rhetoric is very powerful. That's actually something we were talking about in our last webinar as well. And they said, we of course see this in rallies against our programming, aka Drag Story Hour. So just like you were mentioning, that we definitely see those ties between the anti-trans legislation and anti-abortion access, things like that. Andrew said thank you. So yeah, but if you all have questions, feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you. I also have some questions that I can pose in the meantime if people need some time to gather their thoughts. The first question I have is, some coverage has claimed that Kansas advocates succeeded in protecting abortion rights last year from a ballot initiative by catering to anti-vaxxers on the concept of government control. Their conclusion is that to succeed, abortion rights defenders must use frames that run contrary to social justice values to appeal broadly. And so, just wondering what you think of this, what are the long-term consequences of using those kind of compromising frames, and thinking, for instance, of rights-based frames around abortion that undermine access for low-income women, which you were talking about earlier when discussing the Hyde Amendment.
Totally. That's a great question. I think if you talk to the strategists behind Kansans for Constitutional Freedom, which that was the name of the pro-abortion rights ballot initiative campaign, right? Like they called themselves Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. They were very much using this sort of libertarian framing in their official messaging, which was about freedom from government interference. I think that they weren't saying get vaccines out of everyone's arms, right? It wasn't that direct, but I think there was this attempt to sort of they had done polling and they thought this is how we're going to reach the most Kansas voters, is with this constitutional freedom point of view. It's interesting. I shadowed canvassers who were going door to door and they'd say we're with Kansans for Constitutional Freedom. And the person who answered the door would be like, okay, so are you abortion? Yes or no? First of all, no one was under any illusion that this ballot initiative was about anything other than abortion, right? People were okay, constitutional freedom. So are some people thought that meant they were anti-abortion, because it kind of sounds like but when it came down to it, they'd be oh, the abortion thing. So yes, no, where are you? I'm sure that that idea of government, we don't want government interfering in our bodies, is something that I think resonated with some voters. But the most striking thing to me about being on the ground in Kansas around the time of this vote is that there were so many messages that were reaching people that were not from the official campaign. People got impatient with the official campaign and wanted to put up their own signs. And so there were groups just making their own signs. I saw signs that had RBG on them. I saw signs that had kind of ACLU style language around freedom and liberty. There were signs that were much more in a reproductive justice frame. I saw someone standing on a highway with a homemade banner that said birth control is next, right? That's not the official framing, but there were a lot of different messages swirling and people were having conversations with I met one person who was just pacing up and down on a street corner, shouting trust women, Jesus did, at passing cars. That message was reaching people, and she would have people walk by and stop and talk to her. So I guess it can be complicated and we don't I think it would be overly simplistic to look at that and be oh, that's the winning message. It has to be about freedom and don't say the A word and don't use a reproductive justice frame. Because I think reproductive justice frames were used and reproductive justice activists were out in force rallying their communities and talking to people and using that language. They just maybe weren't running television ads, and without those communities and those folks being involved and using their grassroots infrastructure, this wouldn't have gotten passed, right? So we only saw the most visible part.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And it's definitely something to keep in mind for all of us when we want to do this type of work, to not just, take on the most popular kind of thoughts so that we don't reproduce the same systems that we're trying to get rid of currently. I think Rachel has her hand up.
Because I did already ask a question, I'm happy if we do Robin's chat question first and come back to me.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Robin asked if you could talk a little bit more about your book project.
Yeah, if there's any publishers here, I'd love to talk with you. Basically, like I said, I've studied the and thank you for that invitation. I'm working on a book project that basically tries to understand from the perspective of someone who's like studied rigorously and been involved with in a sympathetic way the abortion rights movement, like studying the other side, trying to understand them, which is like an uneasy thing for me. You know, listening to folks who are anti-abortion. It's something where I think being white and being a woman is an asset that allows me like access and a certain level of like facility and comfort with these folks. And just doing like deep listening and trying to understand. It's going to be a narrative project. It's going to focus on a couple of anti-abortion folks and tracing them through these pivotal moments I outlined, starting with the Hyde Amendment and really like studying that as like the first massive failure on the pro-choice side, the first major victory on the anti-abortion side. And I'm just trying to understand this question of like how they won, right? Like my original like working title for this project was like how we lost everything. And then I was like, that's not, no one's gonna buy that. I don't even want to buy that. But I think like that brings up a whole lot of other questions, like how does someone become an activist? Like what makes someone care about an issue? Like what makes someone care about abortion as the issue that will allow them to overlook all of their other values? Like how important are the people for whom that is the case, right? The folks who are like, whatever, the environment, animals, like I got to focus on this. Like how many of those folks are out there, and are they like a decisive part of our like voting populace? Like those are some of the big questions that I want to understand. And I would love your feedback from you all, or like whether you think those are interesting questions, or are those things that you're also thinking about, or like what are the things when you're like, how did we get here? Like, what are the questions that need answering to unpack that question? Because that's like what keeps me up at night, right? Is like, how do we get here? Like our planet is about to like, you know, climate change is upon us, and like how are we here, instead of like massive, you know, coordinated civil disobedience and action on that question, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Rachel?
So I know, especially, sorry, a lot of times the sort of advice for the pro-choice people, I guess, is to start building the same coalitions at the state and local level that were so successful for the anti-choice movement. But as like a DC resident, I don't really have a state and local option. And even like pro-choice politicians like Barack Obama use DC abortion rights as sort of a political bargaining chip. So I guess, I don't know, do you have any recommendations other than the political sort of get out the vote, I guess, advice for people who want to, I don't know, take action to protect this right?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, DC Abortion Fund, like, you know, abortion funds, reproductive justice groups that are doing mutual aid work, like there's an enormous amount of energy and attention going into just like figuring out how to get people to the clinic door. And in a place like DC, that's probably mostly going to involve like bringing people in from out of state, you know, or out of, you know, the district into clinics that are safe. I know like the DuPont Clinic is a huge destination for abortion seekers from all over the country. Yeah, I mean, and there's ways of building local and state power that don't have to do with getting people elected, right? Like I was just speaking with an organizer in the Rio Grande Valley in Texas who organized, she works with an abortion fund, and she and her fellow organizers like got a whole bunch of people together to block one of these sanctuary city for the unborn ordinances
that was proposed in a city named Edinburgh in the Rio Grande Valley. So that was like, they just like swarmed to this meeting and like had a bunch of people testify about their abortion experiences and about why they opposed the ordinance, and like managed to shout it down and get it so that it looked like it was going to pass. And then the like city council members were like, we weren't quite sure it would be like this, and they got intimidated and there were some legal questions and they backed off and it didn't pass. And so, but that wouldn't have happened if they didn't already have like the local networks available. This is the same like organizing groups, like the groups like South Texans for RJ, Frontera Fund, that mobilized when Lizelle Herrera got arrested almost a year ago, before the fall of Roe, got arrested for what seemed to be like murder charges for a self-managed abortion. And there was a huge immediate response, and people were rallying outside the jail, and like, and they had those networks ready to go, right, to respond when someone was criminalized like that. So I think, you know, finding like-minded people and, you know, connecting with them where you are, whether that's, you know, via an abortion fund or just like your neighbors. I think a lot of folks are doing that in this moment. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what DC abortion politics with that. You know more about that than I do.
No, that's great advice. Yeah, especially yeah, that state and local organizing isn't just voting. That's good to keep in mind.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Rachel, and for your answer, Amy. I have another question if no one else has one at this exact moment. My question, back to it, it is, so you've written about the impact of a death caused by abortion bans to galvanize a movement, for instance, in Ireland. What are your thoughts on strategies focused on highlighting the dangers of abortion bans versus rights to bodily autonomy or other narrative frames?
That's such a good question. And I would love to know what other folks in this call think about that. And it's interesting, like going back to the Hyde Amendment that I mentioned in the beginning, like you can see this shift in the rhetoric, right? From people being like, this is an attack on the poor. This is like an injustice. This is like, regardless of what you think about abortion, like this is like anti, you know, poor people. Like that seems like a really winning framework, right? Like it's really clear about what the stakes are. And yet like the fight around the Hyde Amendment became about, because the original version had no exceptions. Henry Hyde actually ended up voting against it the first time around because they added exceptions for the life of the mother. And then the fight became about adding rape exceptions, adding life and health exceptions. It became about exceptions. It became about how dead does a woman have to be? How, you know, young does a rape victim have to be for us to care about her having to cross state lines? Like this is like the framing that we still use, right, around like exceptions and who is worthy of empathy. And it is a limited framing that I think deepens the stigma, because who gets to have access without feeling guilty about it, right? Only like someone who's almost dead or someone who's been raped. And I also, the other thing I want to point out about like exceptions is they're not actually like meaningful. I think they're a marketing tool, because when you close the clinics, when the doctors who are expert in performing abortions leave the state because they can no longer perform the procedures they've been trained to perform, like you can't operationalize an exception, right? Like even if an 11-year-old who's been raped comes into your office, like if you're not trained in that procedure, you don't have a clinic to see that person, like it just doesn't mean anything. And so I think it's like a limited framing rhetorically, and also it's misleading, like just in terms of the reality on the ground. And yeah, I mean, I think for a long time there's been a lack of right, I guess I should say like the mainstream conversation has centered more around exceptions and on like the like almost dead patient, and not on questions of bodily autonomy that are a winning framework that I think most people would agree with, and that also have the benefit of like bringing together in a really natural way LGBTQ people, trans folks who need gender affirming care, people who need abortions, who often are trans, and gender nonconforming folks, and like unifying these different movements and not siloing them in a way that, like, frankly, the right wing is really good at sometimes, right? Like they see these fights as like in lockstep, right? And so I think like the potential for a unified messaging around bodily autonomy is much more profound than saying like, oh, but what about dead people? Like what about like people who are, don't people who are about to die deserve abortions? Like that shouldn't be that's important to highlight that these terrible cases are happening and there is suffering, and like, yes, we need to talk about that, but it shouldn't be the end of the conversation.
Yeah, for sure.
Lillian has a really interesting conversation. Thank you,
Yes.
Lillian.
I see it here. I'll say it just for the recording, if that's okay. Lillian says, I'm watching from Brazil. Here, the far right and anti-abortion movements have been increasing since Bolsonaro's elections 4 years ago. Thank you, Amy, for the presentation. I learned a lot. So yeah, thank you for that comment, Lillian. I have a follow-up question for that one as well. And that is, yeah, following up on that one, what do the attacks on, this is something you kind of touched on a little bit, but what do the attacks on contraception, trans youth, and drag performance that frequently appear to go hand in hand with abortion bans in state legislatures tell us about movement strategy and vision?
Oof. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, like the Christian right, Christian nationalists have like a very coherent, consistent worldview that centers on the white, father-led, heterosexual family. And if you go to, which I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have, to like conferences on anti-abortion or Christian right conferences across the board, you'll hear the same idealized vision of the world that they want, right? Which is like, people don't use contraception because it's evil. They have as many kids as God blesses them with. Women probably don't work. And certainly like same-sex marriage and anyone who differs from like the gender binary is not, doesn't exist, and so that framework that has been, consistent, like that's their ideal. And I think, again, like they're very gifted at rhetoric and political strategy. And so like that ideal has not always been what they lead with, right? They lead with other messaging and strategy. And then folks are like shocked to learn that like, what do you mean they're coming for contraception? And like they've always been coming for contraception, right? Like crisis pregnancy centers that advocate against abortion like also often discourage contraception. Like that's not surprising or like, oh my gosh, it's new. That's part of the project from day one for them. It's just the fact that they've been able to like obscure it because they came for abortion first, or most aggressively and successfully.
Yeah, thank you. Reagan, do you have a question?
I think I don't have a question so much as I have an observation that I think that we all have made and that we're all struggling with. And I think that, boy, if somebody can answer this question like tonight, like we're going to win it all. But I mean, essentially what we have in so many of these arguments, for instance, loss of parental rights, is meaningless. Essentially, it's a false flag, right? Like your parental rights, that's neither here nor there if you have a relationship with your child. then you are walking hand in hand with them through these, moments where they might be led to have an abortion, for instance. So false flag 1, parental rights. The false flag we're seeing in Ohio, which is the Republican speaking point against or wanting to raise the threshold to amend the Constitution. Oh, no, this isn't about that abortion thing that's going on, right? So there's a constant, and then again, what we see in Drag Story Hour. So I work for Drag Story Hour as their grant writer, and a lot of the stuff we are obviously coming up against are these ideas that our programming is inherently sexual. So of course, it's clearly not. Like, drag is a genre of performance. It has nothing to do with sex. It's particularly in the context of Story Hour. So again, there's just an unwillingness to interpret language and facts. And that is the difficulty that I think we're all struggling with. How do you, not that because I think it's a fact, but how do you get somebody and a whole group of somebodies to look at, so what do you think the word sexual means? Okay, cool. Can you look at this programming and understand with me that it's not sexual in any way? Okay, cool. There's the disconnect there. That to me is the big holy grail of struggles. And I don't want to speak for everyone, but I know that there's a lot of us that are just feeling like, I don't know how to overcome that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It is like surreal to me that Drag Queen Story Hour has become like a battleground in like the, these, violent and harmful, assaults that we're having across the board on abortion rights and contraception. And like that is, I saw Laura Jane Grace from Against Me tweet out earlier today, like that Drag Queen Story Hours are seen as sexual because like conservatives can't see women as anything other than sex objects. So it's like, that seems like, yeah, there's a like correlation there, but yeah, when you can't agree on facts, like, I think it's really hard to start a conversation. And I think a lot of that comes down to the like siloing of the media too, and the fact that like a lot of conservatives are getting all of their information from Fox News. And yeah, like if we can't agree on like science and basic human needs, and like then it's really hard to like find common ground. And I also think like a lot of these things, like that ad, like this is about feelings. This is about like stirring up like feelings and emotions. And then like, yeah, it's not necessarily about like, this is the science or this is what the data shows about what people need. But I'm scared about that too, because it's like journalism, research, like all of our, at least the folks whose professions I know on this call, right? Like it only works if people hear what you're saying, believe it, and are moved to act as a result. And I have to believe that that still is meaningful. But it's scary to think that maybe it's not.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Thank you for speaking with us. Amy, I'm gonna ask, do you have any closing remarks, any final remarks before we close out tonight?
Well, thank you so much. These were really interesting observations and questions. So grateful to Alex and Chancey for organizing and facilitating. And yeah, I do have hope that we are in this like moment where it's become clear that the majority of people support access to abortion. I think the majority of people support access to care for trans people too. And I think the results of the midterms made clear that there is a growing gap between leadership, especially in areas like the Supreme Court, and what the majority of people believe. And so I think as we see more and more organizing going on at the grassroots level, I am hopeful that the ground is starting to shift. And I appreciate you all thinking through these issues with me.
Thank you. Yeah, and I mean, we really appreciate you taking the time to kind of, give us some insight from your personal research and reporting, sharing, so much helpful information around anti-abortion strategy, connections to anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ, legislation broadly, as kind of like this lean towards controlling bodily autonomy. That's the general kind of strategy. So yeah, I'll just wrap up by saying that, we invite everyone on this webinar, as well as anyone watching, to visit our website, theirms.org. It's a brand new website. We just launched it, so we're really proud of it. Still getting some things together, but that's where you can find the recording for this webinar, as well as on our YouTube channel. And we also, just as a plug, have extended the deadline for our 2023 Training and Creation Institutes, specifically the institute that's being held in New Mexico from May 11th through the 14th. And so the new deadline, it was supposed to be today, we've extended it to Saturday, April 1st. So that is where you can get more information, about anti-abortion, anti-trans, and anti-drag movements, and how to kind of resist and combat. So thank you everyone for joining us. And yeah, I'll just close it out. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy, for joining us today.
Thank you. This was great.
Mhm.
Appreciate it.